Margaret Johnson, at 68, had spent most of her adult life working as a janitor at Hartwell Industries. She pushed her cleaning cart through the familiar halls, each step measured and slow. These hallways were her constant, the workplace rhythm one she knew like the back of her hand. For over 4 decades, Margaret had kept these offices in pristine condition, wiping tables, scrubbing floors, and ensuring every corner sparkled, even when no one noticed. Despite her efforts, she learned to embrace her role in the background, seeing herself as part of the company's quiet foundation, holding it together when no one was looking. But beneath Margaret's calm exterior was a heart heavy with responsibilities few knew about. She wasn't just a janitor. She was a mother, and more recently, a grandmother raising her 3 grandchildren. 2 years ago, Margaret had lost her daughter to illness, leaving her to care for her grandchildren alone. The added burden weighed heavily on her, each ache in her knees and soreness in her back a reminder of why she couldn't consider retirement just yet. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson." A familiar, warm voice greeted her, breaking the silence of the long corridor. Margaret looked up to see James Anderson, a young accountant with a bright smile and a friendly demeanor. Unlike most employees, who barely noticed her presence, James always took a moment to greet her, showing a kindness that had become rare in the corporate world. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she replied, smiling warmly. "How are you today?" "Oh, I'm doing well, thank you," James said. "And how are your grandkids?" Margaret's face lit up at the mention of her grandchildren. "They're growing too fast, keeping me on my toes every day." She chuckled, the worry easing for a moment. James nodded, his eyes filled with genuine interest. "You're an inspiration, Mrs. Johnson," he said. But before Margaret could respond, a harsh voice cut through the air. "James, do you have work to do, or are you just here to socialize with the help?" Richard Blackwell, the department manager, strode down the hall toward them, his expensive shoes tapping sharply against the polished floors. He was a man known for his cold demeanor and rigid approach to management, but the hostility in his gaze went beyond professionalism. Margaret felt it every time their paths crossed. He looked at her like an inconvenience, a relic of the company's past. James straightened, his friendly expression fading. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell," he replied stiffly before hurrying back to his desk, avoiding Richard's icy glare. Margaret's heart sank, but she kept her eyes down, knowing better than to meet Richard's gaze. "And you?" Richard turned to her, his lips curled in a sneer. "I hope you'll actually get the corners cleaned this time. I'm tired of seeing dust everywhere." His tone was low, but each word carried the familiar sting of disdain. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell. I'll do my best," Margaret murmured, gripping her mop tighter. "Your best," Richard scoffed. "From what I've seen, that's hardly enough." With that, he strode away, leaving Margaret standing alone in the corridor, fighting to keep her composure. This wasn't the first time he'd spoken to her this way, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Richard Blackwell had made it clear that he saw her as little more than an inconvenience. As she returned to her duties, Margaret's mind drifted back to when she first joined Hartwell. Back then, the company had felt like a community, filled with people who respected each other's roles. But over the years, as familiar faces retired and were replaced, the atmosphere shifted. Richard represented everything about the change she despised: a lack of respect, a drive for power over people. In the quiet of the restroom, Margaret moved slowly, her knees protesting each time she crouched to clean. She found herself reflecting on how invisible she'd become, a shadow people only noticed when they needed something. Yet, despite the years of thankless work, she took pride in her job, believing that every contribution mattered, even hers. Unbeknownst to her, James, too, felt the sting of Richard's words and the frustration of staying silent. He had watched the exchange unfold, feeling a pang of guilt as he walked away. He hated how Richard treated Margaret and others, but he knew his place in the hierarchy. Speaking up might cost him his job, a risk he wasn't ready to take. Still, The thought gnawed at him, and as he settled into his cubicle, he found himself struggling to concentrate, the memory of Margaret's resigned expression weighing on him. Little did either of them know, this ordinary day would spark a series of events that would challenge the status quo at Hartwell Industries. Margaret's quiet endurance and James's simmering conscience were set to collide, exposing a deep-seated rot in the company culture and igniting a call for change. Margaret stood in front of the restroom mirror, hands gripping the cold porcelain sink as she took a steadying breath. She'd thought that after decades of enduring silent condescension, and more recently, Richard Blackwell's open disdain, she had grown used to it. But his words still hurt, each one embedding itself into her mind like a thorn. She told herself to let it go. That's what she'd always done. But with her age, her grandchildren's needs, and the mounting medical bills, the weight felt heavier than ever. As she reached for a cloth to wipe down the mirrors, she heard the restroom door swing open, and her heart clenched. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Those expensive leather shoes had a distinctive hollow echo on the tile. "So here we are again." Richard's voice dripped with derision. "Our senior citizen's still at it, I see." He approached, his eyes sweeping over her work with a barely concealed look of disgust. "Are you deaf, Johnson? I told you yesterday, I don't want to see any streaks on the mirrors. They're a disgrace, just like your work ethic." Margaret swallowed hard, her knuckles whitening as she clutched the cloth. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. She'd never been one for confrontation, always choosing her peace over any fight. But today, the silence felt unbearable. "I'm doing my best, Mr. Blackwell," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Your best," he sneered, leaning in closer. "Your best isn't good enough. And let's be honest, it never has been. You're outdated, incapable of keeping up with the demands of a modern company. Why don't you just admit that you're out of your depth?" Margaret's face flushed, but she forced herself to focus on her task. She was too tired, too overwhelmed to engage in this verbal assault. But just then, she noticed a flicker of movement behind one of the stall doors. Her heart leaped when she realized she wasn't alone in the restroom. Richard continued his tirade, oblivious to the witness in their midst. "Honestly, we should have retired you along with those relics you clean. This place isn't a charity, you know. But then again, people like you never understand that, do they?" Behind the stall door, James sat frozen, a witness to this private assault. He had come to the restroom to escape his own stresses, hoping for a moment of quiet. But now, hearing Richard's words, anger welled up inside him. This wasn't the first time he'd seen Richard bully Margaret, and each instance left him feeling complicit in his silence. But as much as he wanted to speak up, fear held him back. A confrontation with Richard could cost him his job, and with his family's reliance on his income, it was a risk he couldn't afford. But as he sat there, listening to Richard's cruel remarks, something inside him snapped. He knew Margaret didn't deserve this, that no one did. Taking a deep breath, James braced himself, his heart pounding as he steeled himself to speak. Meanwhile, Margaret's hands shook as she continued scrubbing, each word from Richard a painful reminder of her vulnerability. She knew she was nearing her limits, not just in strength, but in spirit. As Richard finally turned to leave, he delivered one last parting shot. "Remember, Johnson, there are plenty of younger, more capable workers who would be thrilled to have your job. Don't think you're irreplaceable." The door swung closed behind him, and for a moment, silence filled the restroom. Margaret's shoulders slumped, the tension draining from her. She closed her eyes, steadying herself, only to hear the creak of the stall door. "Mrs. Johnson." James's voice was soft, but carried a weight of concern. She looked up, startled to see him there. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. No one should be spoken to like that." Margaret offered a weary smile, touched by his sincerity. "Thank you, James, but I'm used to it. It's just part of the job." James's expression shifted, a mixture of guilt and frustration on his face. It shouldn't have to be. He hesitated, then continued, Mrs. Johnson, there are people in this company who see what you do and appreciate it. Don't ever think that you're invisible. His words, simple as they were, struck Margaret. She felt a glimmer of hope, a small validation that perhaps her efforts hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. Thank you, James. That means a lot, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. James nodded, then, after a pause, asked, Have you ever considered reporting him? You don't deserve this kind of treatment. Margaret let out a dry chuckle, shaking her head. I thought about it, but he's too well connected. If I tried to complain, they'd find a way to make it disappear, or worse, get rid of me altogether. It's better to just keep my head down. James clenched his fists, anger simmering. He hated the reality of her words, the powerlessness they both felt. But he also knew that silence only allowed people like Richard to keep their grip on power. He thought about the whispers he heard from others, the quiet dissatisfaction building among the employees, especially those who had seen Margaret's tireless work overshadowed by Richard's hostility. As they left the restroom, James felt the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. He wasn't sure what he could do, but he knew he couldn't stand by any longer. This wasn't just about Margaret. It was about everyone who felt unseen, overlooked, and undervalued. That evening, James stayed late, sifting through the company's policy documents and employee handbook. He pored over every section, his eyes scanning for anything that could help Margaret or give him a way to expose Richard's behavior. He noted passages on workplace harassment, ethics, and employee rights, his determination growing with each line. The next morning, he cautiously approached a few colleagues, testing the waters to see if they felt the same way. The response was more than he expected. Many shared similar stories, instances of belittlement or passive-aggressive remarks from Richard. But like James, most were too fearful of retaliation to speak out. It was during one of these quiet conversations that James met Anna, a seasoned HR representative known for her integrity and compassion. She was nearing retirement herself, but had always been vocal about the importance of fair treatment for all employees. After James cautiously confided in her about what he'd witnessed, Anna's face grew serious. James, she said, if you're serious about bringing this up, I'll stand by you. But you should know, Richard has allies high up. This won't be easy. James swallowed, the gravity of the situation settling over him. I know, but I can't just keep watching this happen. Margaret doesn't deserve this, and neither do any of us. Anna nodded thoughtfully. Then let's do it right. Document everything, gather as much support as you can, and we'll approach this strategically. As the days passed, James discreetly collected statements from others, keeping a detailed record of Richard's behavior. The tension in the office grew, an unspoken understanding forming among those who supported Margaret. They offered her small gestures of kindness, and while she didn't know of James's plan, she noticed the change, feeling the warmth and solidarity that gave her strength. At the end of the week, James and Anna prepared to bring their evidence to the company's board, knowing the risks but driven by a newfound courage. They knew that one small act of defiance might not only bring justice for Margaret, but also set a precedent for fair treatment across the company. Little did they know, this moment would be a turning point, not only for Margaret but for everyone at Hartwell Industries. The quiet rebellion brewing in those corridors, born of empathy and courage, would soon bring about a reckoning no one had anticipated. Early Monday morning, Hartwell Industries hummed with the usual start-of-week energy. Employees moved briskly through the corridors, grabbing coffee, chatting in clusters, and checking emails. Yet beneath the surface, a tension simmered, a quiet anticipation as whispers of change circulated. Margaret, pushing her cleaning cart with her usual determination, felt the shift but couldn't quite place it. She had noticed a growing kindness from her colleagues, smiles in the hallway, extra care to keep areas clean, and even small gestures like cups of coffee left on her cart with notes of appreciation. It was a balm to her weary heart, even if it didn't lessen the burden of her responsibilities. Meanwhile, James sat in his cubicle, his stomach in knots. Today was the day. He and Anna had compiled every piece of evidence, every testimony they could gather, and were preparing to confront the board. They'd even managed to gather enough support for a petition, signed anonymously by dozens of employees, urging the board to investigate Richard's behavior. Anna, who had grown disillusioned with the company's direction over the years, felt a renewed sense of purpose, a chance to help foster a workplace that valued every employee, regardless of their position. At precisely 9 a.m., James and Anna entered the small conference room where they'd arranged a meeting with 2 members of the executive board. James's heart pounded as he took his seat, but he reminded himself why he was doing this. For Margaret, for everyone who felt unseen and disrespected by people like Richard. Anna gave him a reassuring nod, her face set with quiet determination. One of the board members, Mr. Charles, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, looked at them expectantly. "Thank you both for arranging this meeting. We were informed you had some concerns about workplace conduct." Anna straightened in her seat. "Yes, Mr. Charles. We have brought forward a case of repeated harassment and discriminatory behavior by one of the department managers, Richard Blackwell, directed primarily toward our long-term janitorial staff member, Margaret Johnson." Mr. Charles' eyebrows lifted slightly. "Richard Blackwell, you say?" James nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes. I've witnessed Mr. Blackwell repeatedly belittling Mrs. Johnson and other minority employees, often in extremely derogatory ways. He regularly targets her in public, making cruel remarks about her age, her job, and even her background. We believe his behavior is not only a violation of company policy, but a direct contradiction to the values Hartwell Industries was built upon." The second board member, Ms. Ramirez, frowned. "Those are serious allegations. Do you have evidence?" Anna handed them a neatly organized file containing documented incidents, statements from witnesses, and even a recording that James had discreetly taken of one of Richard's outbursts. She held her breath as the board members reviewed the file, watching their expressions shift from mild interest to deep concern as they read each account. Finally, Mr. Charles set the file down and met Anna's gaze. "This is troubling," he said slowly. "Hartwell Industries has always prided itself on a respectful and inclusive environment. I'll be honest, these accusations are the first I've heard of any issues involving Mr. Blackwell." Ms. Ramirez leaned forward, her tone firm. "If this is true, we need to address it immediately. But it won't be easy. Mr. Blackwell has been with us for years, and he has powerful allies. Do you understand the potential consequences of moving forward with this?" James glanced at Anna, then nodded resolutely. "Yes, ma'am. But I can't in good conscience ignore what I've seen. Margaret Johnson deserves better, and so does every other employee who's suffered under his management." Ms. Ramirez exchanged a look with Mr. Charles. "Very well. We'll review this information thoroughly. In the meantime, please continue to document any additional incidents. This may take time, but I assure you, we take these matters very seriously." As they left the meeting, a weight lifted off James's shoulders. For the first time, he felt that maybe they could make a difference. He and Anna agreed to keep everything under wraps, knowing that any leak could alert Richard before the board had a chance to investigate. But as the days passed, James grew increasingly anxious. Every time he saw Richard, he feared the manager might somehow sense the brewing storm. Meanwhile, Margaret's days remained as challenging as ever. Though her colleagues' quiet support lifted her spirits, Richard's behavior seemed to worsen. One afternoon, as she scrubbed the hallway near the executive wing, she heard his voice behind her. "Still here, Johnson?" Richard sneered, his footsteps echoing down the polished floor. "Do you even know what retirement is?" Margaret paused, keeping her head down. "I do, Mr. Blackwell, but I have responsibilities." "Responsibilities," he repeated, mocking her tone. You mean the responsibilities of making my hallway spotless? Because from what I see, you're failing at even that." He gestured to an imaginary speck on the floor, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment. "This is pathetic, Johnson. Maybe if you worked as hard as you complained, this place wouldn't look like a dumpster." A flash of anger surged within Margaret, but she held it down, the words on the tip of her tongue held back by years of conditioning. Yet, her hand trembled as she tightened her grip on the mop, willing herself not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. At that moment, James rounded the corner and saw them. Though his heart raced with frustration, he forced himself to stay calm. This confrontation would only fuel the growing file they were compiling against Richard. After Richard left, James approached Margaret, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right, Mrs. Johnson?" She looked up at him, exhaustion etched into her face. "I'm used to it, James, but thank you for caring." James clenched his fists, vowing to make good on his promise. "Soon, Mrs. Johnson, things are going to change around here." A flicker of hope touched Margaret's eyes. She didn't know what he meant, but the sincerity in his voice gave her a sense of comfort. That evening, James and Anna received an email from Ms. Ramirez. She requested a second meeting, this time with more members of the board. As they entered the large boardroom the following day, they were greeted by a panel of executives, each with a solemn expression. The evidence they had gathered had clearly made an impact. "Mr. Anderson, Ms. Mitchell," Ms. Ramirez began, nodding towards them. "Thank you for your dedication to upholding our company's values. The board has reviewed your documentation, and while we're still in the investigation phase, we've decided to take immediate steps." James's heart raced. This was it, the first step toward real change. "We will be implementing a temporary probation on Mr. Blackwell, effective immediately, until further investigation can be completed," Ms. Ramirez continued. "During this period, we will conduct interviews with employees willing to come forward and document any additional incidents." A ripple of relief washed over James and Anna, but it was clear from Ms. Ramirez's face that the journey wasn't over. "I should caution you both, however," she said, her tone grave. "There will be backlash. Mr. Blackwell's supporters won't take kindly to this, and we can't yet guarantee a definitive outcome. But we're committed to seeing this through fairly." James nodded, determined. "Thank you. We understand." Word of Richard's probation quickly spread through the office, sparking a flurry of whispers and speculation. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a strange lightness as she went about her duties. While she wasn't yet aware of James's efforts, she sensed a shift, a silent acknowledgement of her worth. But as the days passed, tensions reached a boiling point. Some of Richard's allies began subtly pushing back, throwing quiet looks of disapproval toward James and Anna, and even snubbing those who had shown support for Margaret. Margaret, oblivious to the brewing undercurrents, continued her work, her quiet resilience like a beacon to those around her. The final straw came one morning when Margaret arrived to find her cleaning supplies sabotage. The mop handle was broken, cleaning fluid spilled across the floor, and a snide note taped to her cart. "Maybe it's time you found a job better suited for someone your age." Her heart sank, the small hope she'd felt crumbling as she took in the mess. She looked around, realizing with a sinking feeling that whoever had done this knew she'd be alone, vulnerable in the early hours. Taking a shaky breath, Margaret set to work, cleaning up the spilled fluids with trembling hands. But before she could finish, James appeared in the hallway. "Mrs. Johnson, what happened?" His voice was filled with concern as he took in the scene. Margaret shook her head, unable to speak as she gestured to the broken supplies and the note. James' expression hardened, the anger he'd kept restrained finally bubbling over. "Enough," he said, his voice resolute. "This ends now." He marched straight to Ms. Ramirez's office, the weight of his silence lifted, replaced by an ironclad resolve. No longer willing to be complicit in a culture that allowed such cruelty, he knocked on her door, prepared to face whatever came next. Margaret sat in the small break room, hands trembling as she clutched a cup of lukewarm tea. The sabotage earlier that morning had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. She had always believed that keeping her head down would shield her from such pettiness, but today had proven otherwise. She couldn't help but feel like the ground beneath her was shifting, as if all the years of silent resilience were finally cracking under the pressure. She just didn't know how much more she could take. A few minutes later, James walked in, his face a mixture of frustration and empathy. He took a seat across from her, watching as she sipped her tea, eyes downcast. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, his voice soft but firm, "I want you to know that what happened this morning won't go unnoticed. It's not right, and it's not something you should have to face." She looked up, meeting his gaze with tired eyes. "I appreciate your kindness, James. Really, I do. But this is just the way things are here. People like Mr. Blackwell and his friends, they've always had the power. I've learned to live with it." James shook his head. "You shouldn't have to live with it. And you're not alone in this, Mrs. Johnson. There are people here who care, who want to see things change. I spoke with Ms. Ramirez this morning about what happened, and she's going to expedite the investigation." Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She had seen countless employees come and go, all with good intentions, but no real power to change anything. But there was something in James's voice, a conviction she hadn't seen in many others. "Thank you, James," she murmured, her voice wavering slightly. "It means a lot to know someone cares." Just then, Anna stepped into the break room, her usual calm replaced by a sense of urgency. She gave Margaret a reassuring smile before turning to James. "We need to talk," she said quietly, gesturing toward the hallway. James rose, giving Margaret a reassuring nod before following Anna. Once outside, she leaned in, lowering her voice. "I spoke to a few more employees. Turns out there's more going on with Richard than we initially thought. Several staff members have mentioned that he's been manipulating schedules, giving unfair performance reviews, and even blocking promotions for anyone he doesn't favor." James's brows furrowed. "Is it enough to build a case?" Anna nodded. "More than enough. But here's the thing. Richard has allies high up. If we're going to expose him, we need solid evidence that even his supporters can't ignore." James felt a flicker of hope mingled with apprehension. "Do you think the board will take action?" "Ms. Ramirez is determined to see this through, but we need to be prepared for pushback. Richard's been here for a long time, and he knows how to protect himself," Anna replied. She glanced back toward the break room, where Margaret still sat alone. "And we can't let what happened this morning slide. Sabotaging her supplies, that's harassment, plain and simple." James nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then let's get to work." For the next few days, James and Anna operated quietly but efficiently, gathering statements, reviewing Richard's track record, and identifying patterns of discrimination. More employees began coming forward, each story adding to the growing file of evidence. A janitor named Lewis mentioned that Richard had once threatened to dock his pay over a fabricated complaint. A young woman in accounting, Sarah, described how Richard had blocked her promotion for over a year, favoring a less qualified friend of his instead. Meanwhile, Richard continued his work as if nothing were amiss, unaware of the storm brewing around him. He remained condescending toward Margaret, but the shifts in the office's atmosphere seemed to escape his notice. People who once tolerated his behavior now kept their distance, refusing to engage with him beyond necessity. The office had become a silent battleground, with alliances forming in hushed conversations and sidelong glances. Margaret felt the change, too. Colleagues she barely knew began stopping by to chat, offering small gestures of support that lifted her spirits. She didn't understand the full scope of what was happening, but she felt a quiet strength building around her. It was as if, for the first time, she wasn't entirely alone. One afternoon, Margaret was cleaning near the executive wing when she overheard raised voices coming from one of the conference rooms. She paused, her heart quickening as she recognized Ms. Ramirez's voice, firm and unwavering. "I don't care how long he's been here, Charles. This behavior is unacceptable, and it goes against everything we claim to stand for," Ms. Ramirez was saying, her tone heated. A male voice responded, his tone cautious. "Look, Ramirez, I get it. But you know Richard has connections. Taking disciplinary action could cause waves we're not prepared to handle." Margaret's pulse raced. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but she couldn't bring herself to move away. "Then it's time we face those waves," Ms. Ramirez replied, her voice resolute. "Hartwell Industries cannot afford to ignore this any longer. Either we uphold our values, or we accept that our culture is toxic. Which is it?" Margaret backed away, her heart pounding. She resumed her work, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd just heard. It was the first time she'd felt hope that someone in power might actually take a stand. She didn't want to let herself believe it fully, but a part of her began to wonder if real change was possible. Later that day, James found her in the break room, his face glowing with restrained excitement. "Mrs. Johnson, I think things are moving faster than we thought." Margaret looked up at him, her expression guarded but hopeful. "What do you mean?" James glanced around to make sure they were alone before lowering his voice. "The board is planning a formal review of Richard's conduct, and from what I've heard, they're not holding back. They've asked every employee who's interacted with him to give an honest account. They're finally listening." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she processed his words. She had endured Richard's belittling and cruelty for so long that the thought of it finally ending felt surreal. I never thought anyone would care enough to take it this far." James gave her a warm smile. "People do care, Mrs. Johnson. You've touched more lives here than you realize. And if this investigation goes the way we hope, it could lead to real change. For you and for everyone." The following morning, a formal notice was posted in the break room and sent out via email, announcing an investigation into Richard's conduct and encouraging employees to come forward with any relevant information. The news sent a ripple through the office, with hushed conversations and exchanged glances. For many, it was the first time they felt they could speak openly, unafraid of retaliation. Richard, however, was livid. As soon as he saw the notice, he stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. Through the glass walls, employees watched as he furiously typed on his computer, no doubt attempting to contact his higher-ups in an effort to squash the investigation. That afternoon, as Margaret was cleaning in a secluded corridor, Richard found her. His face was flushed with anger, his expression twisted with contempt. "So," he sneered, "this little coup, was it your idea?" Margaret looked up, startled by his sudden appearance. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she held her ground, her chin lifting slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Blackwell," she replied calmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "Oh, don't play dumb with me, Johnson," he snapped, stepping closer. "You think you can turn people against me, get me removed. I built this department, and I won't let some washed-up janitor ruin my career." Margaret clenched her fists, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. For the first time, she looked him directly in the eye, refusing to back down. "I don't have that kind of power, Mr. Blackwell. I'm just here to do my job, something you seem to think is beneath you." Richard's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You're nothing, Johnson. A relic, a nobody. And once this investigation is over, I'll make sure you're out of here for good." Margaret's gaze remained steady. "Do what you must, Mr. Blackwell. But I think you'll find that people have a lot more to say than you realize." With that, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. She knew she had taken a risk, but for the first time, she felt unafraid. The tide was shifting, and she could sense it. Richard's reign of intimidation was finally being challenged, and she would not stand in the way of justice. Back in his office, Richard fumed, pacing as he tried to regain control of the situation. But his efforts to halt the investigation were proving futile. The board, spurred by Ms. Ramirez's determination, had committed to transparency, unwilling to let his influence sway them. As Margaret resumed her work, she found herself unexpectedly filled with a new sense of purpose. For too long, she had been just another face in the crowd, her years of loyalty overlooked. But now, people were finally noticing her, standing up for her, and it felt like a long overdue validation of her worth. Little did she know, the next few days would bring even more revelations, testing her strength and resilience in ways she never expected. But for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly seen, and that knowledge gave her the courage to face whatever came next. By the time Thursday morning dawned, the atmosphere at Hartwell Industries had transformed from tense to electric. Employees whispered by the coffee machine, glancing at Richard's office with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Rumors swirled about the impending board meeting, where he would face a formal review of his conduct. Margaret, unaware of the full extent of the situation, felt an unusual lightness in her step as she pushed her cleaning cart down the corridor. For the first time in years, she sensed the subtle support from her colleagues, a silent affirmation of her worth beyond her job title. James, on the other hand, was more aware of the stakes. The board's decision was set for tomorrow, and he felt the weight of what he and Anna had set in motion. He noticed a tension in the eyes of many employees, some of them torn between fear of repercussions and hope for real change. It was an unspoken struggle, one that connected them all. They were no longer isolated individuals dealing with Richard's arrogance. They were a collective, each of them a witness to the systemic cruelty that had festered under his authority. That afternoon, as Margaret finished cleaning the break room, Ms. Ramirez approached her, her expression serious yet kind. "Mrs. Johnson, would you mind coming with me for a moment?" Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Though she'd had friendly exchanges with Ms. Ramirez before, she'd never been asked to meet with her formally. She followed her into a small private office where Anna and James were waiting. They both gave her encouraging smiles, and Margaret relaxed a little, though uncertainty still loomed. Ms. Ramirez closed the door and took a seat across from Margaret. "Mrs. Johnson, I wanted to speak with you in confidence. There have been serious allegations of misconduct against Mr. Blackwell, and we believe your account could be critical in confirming them. If you're comfortable, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your experiences." Margaret glanced at James and Anna, her heart swelling with gratitude for their support. Taking a steadying breath, she nodded. "I'll do my best, Ms. Ramirez." For the next hour, Margaret recounted her experiences in detail. She spoke about the constant condescension, the dismissive looks, and Richard's harsh words. She told them about the sabotage of her cleaning supplies and the verbal attacks that had worn her down over the years. Though it was painful to relive those memories, each word felt like a burden lifting from her chest, a cleansing of years' worth of silent suffering. By the end of her account, the room was quiet, each person processing the impact of her words. Ms. Ramirez reached out, her hand resting gently on Margaret's. "Thank you for sharing this with us, Mrs. Johnson. I'm truly sorry for what you've endured here, and I assure you, this will not go ignored." Margaret felt a mix of relief and vulnerability, her voice soft as she replied. "Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. I only ever wanted to do my job, to be part of this company. I never wanted any trouble." Ms. Ramirez gave her a gentle smile. "You have been more than a part of this company, Margaret. Your dedication and kindness have left a mark here, one that deserves to be respected." After the meeting, Margaret walked through the corridors with a newfound confidence. She was no longer afraid of Richard's gaze, no longer shrinking under his disdain. She felt like a person with worth, someone who belonged. As she returned to her duties, she noticed the subtle nods of encouragement from her colleagues, each one a silent acknowledgement of her courage. The following morning, as the employees gathered in small groups, word spread that the board had summoned Richard to an emergency meeting. The air was thick with anticipation, and for once, Margaret didn't feel nervous. She knew that, whatever the outcome, she had found her voice, and she wasn't alone. Inside the boardroom, Richard sat across from Ms. Ramirez, Mr. Charles, and several other executives, his face taut with irritation. He glanced at the stack of documents on the table, knowing full well they held accounts from various employees, all detailing his treatment of Margaret and others. His jaw clenched as he realized the gravity of the situation. For the first time, his position felt unstable. Ms. Ramirez's gaze was steady, her tone unyielding. "Mr. Blackwell, we have reviewed the complaints brought against you. This behavior is not only unprofessional but entirely unacceptable. We've gathered testimonies from multiple employees, including Mrs. Johnson, whose accounts depict a pattern of intimidation and discrimination." Richard's face flushed. "With all due respect, these allegations are baseless. Margaret Johnson is just a janitor. I was holding her to the company's standards. She's slow, inefficient, and frankly, outdated. My actions were about maintaining productivity, not targeting anyone." Ms. Ramirez's expression hardened. "You think Mrs. Johnson's role is insignificant, Mr. Blackwell. She's been with this company for 40 years, longer than many of us here. She's dedicated her life to keeping this workplace running smoothly, and her commitment has gone beyond any job description. The fact that you would dismiss her contribution reveals the true nature of this issue." Richard's arrogance faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Look, I was just trying to enforce discipline. If that offends people, then maybe they're too sensitive for corporate life." Mr. Charles leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Blackwell, enforcing discipline does not equate to belittling, harassing, or intimidating employees. Hartwell Industries prides itself on creating a supportive environment, not one where people fear their supervisors." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room as Richard seemed to grasp the reality of the situation. He opened his mouth, as if to defend himself, but the words faltered. The tide had turned against him, and he sensed it. Ms. Ramirez straightened in her seat. "Effective immediately, Mr. Blackwell, you are placed on indefinite suspension pending further review. Depending on the findings, termination is likely." Richard's face paled as the words sank in. He looked around the room, as if hoping for support, but was met with stony faces. His reputation, his status, everything he'd built his identity upon, was crumbling. Back in the main office area, employees began to notice as Richard gathered his belongings, his face a mixture of shock and resentment. He avoided eye contact, each step heavier than the last as he walked out of the building. No one stopped to say goodbye, and for the first time, Richard felt the sting of isolation, the very same isolation he had imposed on others. Margaret, unaware of the final decision, went about her tasks with a peace she hadn't felt in years. She was scrubbing a hallway floor when she heard a soft, hesitant voice behind her. "Mrs. Johnson." She turned to see James and several of her colleagues, including Anna, standing nearby with smiles on their faces. "Did something happen?" Margaret asked, her voice laced with curiosity. James grinned. "Richard's gone. The board suspended him. His conduct was exposed, and he won't be coming back." Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief. He's really gone." Anna stepped forward, her voice warm. "Yes, Margaret. And it's because of people like you. People who stood up for what was right. You didn't let him break your spirit. You've shown us all what true strength looks like." Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat, overwhelmed by the support she never realized had been there. She had spent so long feeling invisible that the sudden attention left her speechless. Finally, she managed a soft, heartfelt "thank you." James stepped closer, his expression serious. "Mrs. Johnson, you're more than just a janitor. You're a pillar of this company, a reminder of what it truly means to care about the work you do. We're honored to work alongside you." As they stood together in the quiet hallway, Margaret felt a sense of peace and fulfillment that she hadn't known in years. She realized now that her work had never been thankless. It was simply unspoken, recognized in the silent appreciation of those who valued the stability and care she brought to each day. And today, that appreciation had finally found a voice. Over the next few weeks, Hartwell Industries implemented new policies to ensure a safe, respectful workplace. An anonymous feedback system was introduced, allowing employees to report mistreatment without fear. Training sessions were scheduled to educate management on fair treatment and inclusivity, with emphasis on the value of every role within the company. As for Margaret, she continued her work, her steps a little lighter and her heart a little stronger. The halls no longer felt daunting or lonely. They felt like home, a place where she was valued. And though she had endured years of hardship, she knew that the strength she had found within herself was a testament to her resilience, a strength that had, in the end, sparked a change that would protect others long after she'd gone. And every morning, as she pushed her cart down the hallways of Hartwell Industries, she was greeted with warm smiles, nods of respect, and a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret Johnson was no longer just a name on a payroll. She was a symbol of courage, a beacon for all those who walked those corridors after her, a reminder that sometimes even the smallest voices have the power to bring about profound change. The weeks that followed Richard's departure transformed Hartwell Industries in ways Margaret had once thought impossible. The tension that had once lingered in the air gave way to a sense of openness and camaraderie. Departments that had rarely communicated before were now working together to ensure a healthier work environment. In meetings and emails, Margaret's name came up often, not as a symbol of conflict, but as a reminder of the strength and resilience that had quietly held the company together for years. On a sunny Monday morning, Margaret arrived at work to find a surprise waiting for her. A small crowd had gathered in the lobby, each person holding something: cards, flowers, small tokens of appreciation. James and Anna stood at the center, their faces beaming with pride. Margaret's heart fluttered as she approached, her usual calm replaced by a mix of confusion and excitement. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James stepped forward, extending a large bouquet of bright sunflowers and roses. "This is for you, Mrs. Johnson. Consider it a small token of gratitude from all of us for everything you've done." Anna nodded, holding out a card signed by dozens of employees. "Your kindness, patience, and dedication have been an inspiration to everyone here. You've shown us what true resilience looks like, Margaret." As she took the flowers, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She had spent decades in the shadows, unnoticed and unappreciated, and now, in the twilight of her career, she was finally being recognized. The years of hardship, the endless nights of worry about her grandchildren's future, all of it felt lighter in this moment. "Thank you," she managed, her voice trembling. "Thank you all. I never thought I'd see a day like this." Her colleagues gathered around her, sharing stories of how her quiet strength had inspired them. Some spoke about the small moments when Margaret had offered a comforting word or a helping hand, gestures she had long forgotten, but that had clearly left an indelible mark on those she'd helped. It was then that Margaret understood that her impact on the company had been profound, even if it had gone unspoken for so long. Later that day, Ms. Ramirez called Margaret to her office, her expression warm and inviting. As Margaret took a seat, Ms. Ramirez leaned forward, her hands folded on the desk. "Margaret," she began, "I wanted to personally thank you for your courage and integrity. Because of you, we've initiated a new policy framework aimed at ensuring fairness and respect across all levels of the company. Your resilience has inspired a shift that will benefit generations to come." Margaret smiled, a mix of pride and humility on her face. "Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. I never intended for any of this to happen. I just wanted to do my job and provide for my family." Ms. Ramirez nodded. "And that dedication is precisely what makes you exceptional. In recognition of your contributions, the board has approved a special pension fund for you. It's our way of ensuring you're supported, as you have supported us for so many years." Margaret's eyes widened in shock. "A pension fund? But I didn't expect anything like this." Ms. Ramirez smiled. "You've earned it, Margaret. This is more than a reward. It's a testament to the impact you've had on this company." We want you to feel secure, not just for yourself, but for the family you work so hard to provide for." Margaret felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. For so long, her work had felt invisible, her contributions taken for granted. But now, as she sat in that office, surrounded by the appreciation of those she'd unknowingly influenced, she realized that her years of dedication had not been in vain. The following weeks brought more changes, not just for the company, but for Margaret herself. The board had offered her an early retirement package, along with the pension fund, ensuring that her financial concerns were alleviated. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Free from the need to push through each day, free to focus on her grandchildren, and to explore a life outside of work. On her last day at Hartwell Industries, the company held a farewell party in her honor. The break room, usually quiet and reserved, was transformed with banners, balloons, and a table laden with food and drinks. Colleagues from every department had gathered, each one eager to say goodbye to the woman who had come to embody the heart of their workplace. James raised a toast, his voice filled with admiration. "To Margaret Johnson, who showed us all the true meaning of resilience, may your future be as bright and joyful as the light you've brought into our lives." Applause filled the room, and Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude. She looked around, her gaze resting on each person who had shown her kindness, who had believed in her and supported her. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not just as a janitor, but as a person who had left a lasting legacy. As the festivities wound down, Margaret shared quiet moments with her colleagues, each goodbye a bittersweet reminder of the journey she'd traveled. She knew she'd missed the familiarity of the halls she'd walked for decades, the rhythm of her daily tasks, the comfort of her routine. But she also felt ready for this new chapter, a chapter that was hers to shape, free from the burdens she had carried for so long. On her way out of the building, Margaret paused by her cleaning cart one last time, running her fingers over the familiar handle. She whispered a quiet goodbye to the tools that had been her companions for so many years, a symbol of the quiet strength she had brought to her work. As she stepped into the lobby, she was surprised to find her grandchildren waiting for her, their faces bright with smiles. They ran to her, embracing her with the boundless love that had always kept her going. Behind them stood James, Anna, and several other colleagues, each one there to witness the beginning of her new life. "Ready to go, Grandma?" her eldest granddaughter asked, her eyes shining with pride. Margaret smiled, looking down at the little faces that had given her purpose and strength. "Yes, I am," she replied, her voice filled with quiet joy. She took their hands, feeling a new sense of purpose as they walked out of the building together. As she stepped into the fresh air, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For years, she had been a silent pillar, holding up the company's foundation without acknowledgement or reward. But now she understood that her value had never been tied to anyone else's recognition. Her worth had always been in her dedication, her love, and her quiet, unyielding strength. Hartwell Industries would continue on, its halls filled with new faces, its walls echoing with new stories. But Margaret Johnson's legacy would remain, a reminder that sometimes true courage lies not in grand gestures, but in the quiet resilience of those who stand tall, even when no one is watching. As she walked away from the place that had been her life for so many years, Margaret knew one thing for certain. She had finally found her freedom. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace, ready to embrace a future filled with the love and happiness she had so richly earned.